Hello, everybody. Hi. Good evening. Thank you all for being here. My name is James Bennett. I'm the editor-in-chief and president of The Atlantic, and it's my privilege to welcome you here tonight. I'd like to thank our partner, Sixth and I, for hosting us in this magnificent space. And I'm delighted to introduce two of my favorite writers who also happen to be two of my favorite people. Ta-Nehisi Coates, of course, is the author of the piece that's brought us all here tonight. That story, The Case for Reparations, has been in the works at The Atlantic for about 2 years, but I think it's fair to say that a lifetime of reporting and reflection went into it. It struck a very deep chord, as demonstrated by the presence of all of you here. That issue is actually selling out on newsstands right now across the country, and the piece brought more visitors to the Atlantic's website in a single day than any previous magazine piece we've ever published. Ta-Nehisi is a national correspondent for The Atlantic. He writes regularly for the magazine and for our flagship site, theatlantic.com, where he's created a space for some of the most civil debate, really, about politics and culture that exists anywhere on the web. Ta-Nehisi won a National Magazine Award 2 years ago for an essay that we called Fear of a Black President. He's the author of a memoir, The Beautiful Struggle, A Father, Two Sons, and an Unlikely Road to Manhood. And he's also an occasional guest op-ed columnist for the New York Times, even though he knows it ruins my morning to open my paper and see him there. Jeffrey Goldberg, who will be interviewing Ta-Nehisi, is also a national correspondent for The Atlantic, also a winner of a National Magazine Award, and also the author of a powerful memoir. He's also, as we were just discussing backstage, a guy who wears gray suits all the time. One of the ways I tell them apart is reminding myself that Jeff's memoir is about Israeli-Palestinian relations. It's called Prisoners, a story of friendship and terror. Jeff's focus is the Middle East, but like Ta-Nehisi, he covers a wide range of subjects from politics to entertainment to policing. I'd like to just close with a quick word about The Atlantic, which maybe provides some context for the work of both these writers and for this piece in particular. The Atlantic was founded in 1857, in part with the goal of being entertaining and capturing a new emerging American voice in letters. But our founders laid down a deeper purpose than that. They said that the Atlantic would be of no party or clique. It would be profoundly independent, not just in a political sense, but in how it approached all sorts of big ideas. And they said they would honestly endeavor to be the exponent of what its conductors believed to be the American idea. They didn't actually define what they meant by the American idea, but what they had in mind was made very clear by their first order of business, which was to seek the abolition of slavery, which was a very radical idea in 1857. And down through the decades, from slavery through Reconstruction through civil rights, writers like Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Martin Luther King, and many, many others have debated the way forward in the pages of The Atlantic with the goal of realizing the full promise of the principles that this country was founded on. So that's the tradition in which both Ta-Nehisi and Jeff are working. And with that, I give you Jeff and Ta-Nehisi.
Lights out.
Thank you. Thank you, James. Thanks to everyone who's come out tonight. Thanks to Sixth and I. We are going to have a conversation up here, and then because this is a synagogue that we're all in, this is sort of a little piece of inside information. After speeches in synagogues, you don't have Q&A. You just go right to corrections. So we're going to have we'll have a corrections period after this. But let's just jump right in.
Okay.
And start at the beginning, or what I think of as the beginning of your multi-year process on this. 4 years ago, you were writing about something. You stated on the blog that you were opposed to reparations. 4 years or so later, you have now identified yourself rather
ostensibly for it.
Seemingly for
Seemingly, it was only on the cover. I mean, you know.
Yeah, you kind of own it now.
Right.
What happened? What changed?
You know, one of the coolest things, you know, about being at the Atlantic is the opportunity to think publicly, and to have to interact with people, and for people to say things that are, you know, oppositional. And I was in an interview last week, and somebody had actually went through the comments of that actual post. And about 100 comments in, I'm debating with some guy, and I said, you know, I'm not really, you know, for reparations. I don't think we should do this. But, you know, the one thing I do think about all the time is redlining. And those people are very much alive, and they deserve so. I have forgotten I even said that. But, you know, it's there. It's clearly there. And, you know, I wasn't at that time because I think we were, you know, at a certain place, you know, with, you know, Barack Obama being in the presidency, and maybe I was a little bit more optimistic about, you know, where we were going as a country. More than that, though, there was a whole body of research that at that point I just was unaware of. And I kept getting the feeling in a lot of the conversations I was having and a lot of the debates that we were talking over something. There were things that we were not saying, and that went for our conversations about school, that went through our conversations about gentrification. I remember feeling it in, you know, some of the conversations I had with people on the blog about gentrification here in DC, for instance. And the big thing that seemed to be looked over is that African Americans in this country have significantly less wealth than white Americans in this country. And it's not even like a small comparison. When I say significantly less, you know, I mean a degree of 20 to 1. I mean, it's just not, it's not even comparable. I think, you know, what we say in the story is something like 1/3 of African Americans either have no wealth or basically negative assets. And that is, you know, at the root of so much. It's not the only thing, but it's at the root of so many of our problems. And you take that and you compound it. And this became apparent to me as I started doing the research about the fact that African Americans are the most segregated group in the country. So not only do you have a group of people who have less wealth than everybody, their entire network are people who have less wealth. And so it's compounded. So while, you know, white Americans, you know, have more wealth, they also know more people with more wealth also. And then you have this population of people who have less and live, you know, their lives knowing only people who have significantly less. Now, how did that happen? And that was really, you know, what became clear to me. And, you know, having that notion, knowing something, you know, just a little bit going in about redlining, it was quite clear that our housing policy was part of that. So about a year and a half or so ago, I picked up a story in the New York Times. And my dad is here in the middle here, and I don't know if he remembers this phone call, but the story was about a family that was suing Stuyvesant High School in New York. It was a very, very competitive school. You take a test and you get in. And the problem basically, or as they described it was a problem, is Asian students and Asian American, you know, students who are already here were basically coming in and they were just killing the test. And they were basically, you know, running, you know, everybody out. But especially, you know, African Americans, very low percentage. And I found myself, as I read through that story, being very, very sympathetic to the Asian and Asian American students who were like busting their backside, you know, to do well on this test. How can you, you know, root against that? And then at the end of the story, there was an African American mother who says, you know, I don't feel like my daughter should have to study Sunday to Sunday for a test to go to a good school. And this like enraged me, you know, some of my latent sort of black nationalism, team black feeling. You have to work too. Did I lose my mic? Okay, I'm good. All right, I'm all right, it's okay, I'm good, we're all right. We're all right, I think we're okay. All right.
No more emotion.
Right, yeah. Now I gotta keep it even keel here. Right. But, you know, it just absolutely pissed me off. I was like, how can you say that? You know, we're in a competition. Everybody got to work hard. What do you mean you have to work Sundays? You got to work Sunday to Sunday. And I went to bed and I woke up the next morning. And I was still thinking about it, still pissed off. But it occurred to me that actually, in fact, there are places in this country where people don't have to work Sunday to Sunday to take a test. And that those people tend to live places that if you went back, you know, 30, 40, 50 years, African Americans were barred from. And they weren't, borrowed from strictly as, private citizens borrowing them, but as a matter of government policy, that we are deeply implicated, in these problems that we're really trying to put Band-Aids over. And so I fired off, this rather, I guess, radical email to, Scott Stossel, editor of the magazine. And I said, what if we just take this back? Let's argue for reparations. That's really what we're talking about here. There's been a massive, wealth stealing operation that's happened in this country. And what if we just argue, against that? So there it was.
No, I want to come back to the idea that this is radical in a minute, but I want to ask you something else about the body of the piece. I forgot, a number of people on Twitter and elsewhere have pointed out that the way you can tell a person who hasn't read the story, has only read the cover, is when they tweet something like, well, the slaves are all dead, who are you going to give reparations to anyway? Because it's, the piece is really not about slavery. It's about, it's a lot about housing policy, and it's about a period from the 20s to, like, say, the 60s or 70s. I'm curious why you went that route, because it seems, and maybe this is my own predisposition, but it seems, based on the history, that when you take something from someone, you either make restitution to that person or you make restitution to the descendants. It's not a weak argument. But why have you focused so much on the modern piece to the exclusion of 250 years? Right.
Well, the argument, against enslavement has been made, by other people. And I thought in a pretty public forum, Randall Robinson had a very, very good book called The Debt that came out, I guess around 99 or so. And it, very much leaned on that period. And, part of writing this article was just a basic narrative challenge. Okay, so, somebody who thinks they know about this, we knew, you're going to see reparations, and how do you get that person that's like, oh my God, another reparations article? So right from the beginning, knowing that, if you rooted it in housing, you very much could find people who were alive. We wouldn't have to, we could get right past that question. We could say, you know what, slavery, we'll give you that one. Let's just do the 20th century. We can just do the 20th century. We can say, hey, everything's even. And then we can go from the 20th century forward and we'll be okay. And you can make the case just based on it. I'm not advocating that. I think there's certainly a case for, enslavement. And then it became new, like if you can find actual people who say, look, I got ripped off, this happened, government's responsible, these people over, the entity that did it is responsible, and I am very much still here. And that felt hot. Like that felt like something I wanted to read. Like I wanted to see that guy. Even before I found him, I was like, I know, that guy, that woman is out there.
Can you give us 2 minutes on the guy?
Yeah. Well, there are a few, but the lead character is a gentleman by the name of Mr. Clyde Ross, and this is like why it's so important to report. If there's been any frustration with the replies, it's that people who are replying are sitting on their backside and firing off their 800 words, and that's cool. I fired off my share of 800 words to reported people, but the lived experience of sitting. I want you to go sit with a 91-year-old black dude who was born in Mississippi in the 1920s, whose family had things, was not, poor comparatively, and everything was taken from him. Everything was taken from his family: land, mules, horses, buggies, everything. I want you to sit with a guy who, was really, really intelligent and still just like really sharp. Even now. Was told by his teachers, you know what, you really should be going to a fancier school. But could not go to that school because his family had been reduced to sharecropping.
There was a Rosenwald school somewhere.
It was a Rosenwald school, right, that everybody knew he should go to, he could not go to. A man who went off and served his country in World War II, came back, could not live in Mississippi, thought he was going to be killed if he stayed there. Went to Chicago, thought, Chicago to be, a relatively fair place. He was able to get a decent wage. Was effectively barred from getting a mortgage, a legitimate mortgage. Went out and thought he had a mortgage, but was basically a really, high class or concealed, rent-to-own program in which, where other people were building wealth through mortgage, he could not build any equity through his alleged mortgage. The person who told him that he had a mortgage kept the deed, and if he missed one payment, all the money that he had put down would be taken from him. And I just want people to go sit with that dude and tell him he's owed nothing. You know, it's one thing to like sit here theoretically, and that was one of the reasons why you get people. I sit here, like we think about slaves as this, sort of far-off thing, or people are going to get reparations like this. No, that guy, right there in North Lawndale in Chicago, living right there. Tell him he's not owed anything. You know what I mean? And then after you see him, the fact of the matter is, there are tons of African Americans like this. I mean, I just can't tell you how many, either African Americans who this happened to, or who, the kids of people who it happened to have written me and said, listen, we tried to buy a house, we tried to do this, we couldn't do this, we couldn't do that. It's, I think people underestimate just how broad this was.
Come back to this word radical, because I'm fascinated by this, in part because I don't see this as a radical.
It's kind of not.
Well, I don't see it as a radical idea because it's sort of obvious when you talk about moral restitution.
Right.
But moreover, it's this, I guess, and you end your piece in this, and I want to go to this for a good chunk of time. 7 years after the end of the Holocaust, Germany paid reparations. They made reparations to Jews, to Israel, and to individual Jews. I mean, there are some people in Israel who were opposed to that because they didn't want blood money, but it wasn't understood as politically radical in the same way. And the response to your piece is, I mean, obviously there's a huge response to the piece, a huge response to this idea. On the other hand, I was just with a progressive Southern politician yesterday who said, there's no chance that this conversation will ever even happen in Congress, much less legislation. So what is going on in this country where this idea, even you could call it, maybe semi-sardonically, but semi-seriously, a radical idea? Well,
sometimes ideas are defined by who's advocating for them, as opposed to whether the idea is, in itself, that, out there. And as it, has happened, and this was not always true, by the way, as we documented in the piece, advocating for reparations was not always seen as a radical idea. But because we've made certain agreements about what we're going to talk about and what we're not going to talk about, basically it's been left to radicals to make that, to advocate for the issue. And that's a good thing, by the way. That's no slight at, the radicals who've been, advocating for it, because if they hadn't, nobody would. And it's very important that it sit there and remain. And I think, when we talk about agreements, one of the things we've decided is we are not going to talk about the things that happened within the 20th century in our cities. One of the hard things about going to research this piece is 1995, I came to the city of Chicago for the first time as an adult. And I don't know how many people here are familiar with Chicago, but if you are, you'll know that there used to be a long line of projects in public housing down the Dan Ryan Expressway. And I rode with a friend down the Dan Ryan, and I saw that, and it occurred to me as an absolute moral catastrophe that people should live that way. It never occurred to me that somebody planned for it to be that way. And didn't just like plan like I want those here, but no, I want black people to live here. It never occurred to me that there were laws passed, that there actually was, on the basis of segregation in Chicago, well within the 20th century, well within the time of people who are alive right now. It never occurred to me that all through the white communities where black people were trying to, move themselves up out of the ghetto, where they were trying to buy, that there were riots. I didn't know this. That there were white people, setting bombs under people's houses. That there were mobs assembling. There were whole neighborhood associations that were forming, that this was actually a force in how our cities look. I don't know why we decided to forget that, but we did, and by making it, feel like it's the deep, deep past, then it becomes right. It's just like, it's this idea that you're advocating for something that happened a long, long time ago.
In other words, we've made restitution for slavery by ending slavery.
Right.
That's the story.
Right. I've stopped stabbing you, so therefore I've made restitution for stabbing you.
I no longer hold you hostage, therefore you should just
it's all okay.
Move on with your life. But let's stay on this idea of radicalism, if you will. I mean, I think a lot of Americans would say a couple of things. One, there's a superficial response to this. So it's like, we have a black president. You can't say that things aren't better in America. And by a lot of indices, they are better, obviously, than they were 50 years ago. So there's that argument. And the other argument is that in our democracy, it's a self-correcting democracy. We had slavery, and then we didn't anymore, and we had Jim Crow, and now we don't. The Voting Rights Act, where we once didn't. So in other words,
I love that term, self-correcting, as though no one actually advocated for the voter, like nobody died, like there was no actually.
But
Obviously, I'm not accusing you of that. But,
the democracy itself has, I mean, and that's
Right.
the blessing of democracy, is that when there's a problem, a group of people, and then a larger group of people rise up. It obviously always starts as a minority of people, but rise up and they fix it. Gay rights started with 12 people, and now it's kind of generally accepted in most parts of the country, and so on. But my question is, what do you say to people who say, look, the country is a lot better for African Americans. There is equality now of at least theoretical equality of access and education.
Right.
I mean,
the problem with that argument is, can you say that about basically anything? I mean, surely we are better now that women have the right to vote. So therefore, let's not talk about any issues around women at all. I mean, if you're going to make the progress, you can take any sector of society and say, isn't it better for you to be alive right now than it was 100 years ago? But that's going to be true for most Americans. So therefore, let's have no domestic policy. You know, I mean, if that's really going to be among the many problems, but if that's going to be the argument, I mean, that's kind of what we're reduced to. You know, the things you just mentioned, every single one. You know, probably with the exception of enslavement in this country, which we had to have a war over. You're right, it's a democratic process, right? Well, I mean,
that was a reaction. I mean, that was, it was a violent reaction. Right. Opposed to a nonviolent reaction, but it was saying correction.
Right. Well, this can be a correction too.
Right.
Here's another correction.
Let's go to the other critique of the piece. I told you this morning that I was going to attack you from the left, just to switch things up.
Right.
But you know, one of the things that people say is that you build this case, then you don't pull the trigger. You don't tell us what it costs. What is this thing? And some of your critics have said, including in our magazine on the Atlantic website, have said, this is a lovely piece, beautifully written. You're right about the moral arguments, but this is completely impractical. What are you talking about? Who is paying for what to whom? Can you, I know you've been avoiding that a little bit. Maybe it's part 2, another 16,000 words.
I would love it. That'd be awesome.
With you in a calculator. Just kind
of.
But talk about that. Go into it. Like, how would this actually?
So 2 parts to that. I mean, we know, the WHO is. I mean, the WHO is the United States government. And there's great confusion in the society as a whole, I guess. But there's great confusion on this subject because people think of reparations and they think of white people giving money to black people. Like individually, I will trace your lineage and see were you the person that's, made the redlining
Actually,
map.
Come out of your taxes too.
Right, that's exactly, and it always does. It always does. If I walk outside, God forbid, Sixth and I, and the police jump on me and beat me, within an inch of my life, and I sue Washington, the city of Washington, D.C., if I were a resident of D.C., it would come out of my taxes too. I would sue the entity, itself. And that's generally true. I mean, we had reparations for Japanese Americans, right? Those Japanese Americans were citizens. It came out of their funds too. It wasn't like a non-Japanese American suit. And that's generally how it would work. So it's not a suit against, individual white people on behalf of black people. That's the first thing. The second thing was, oh my God, I got going. I forgot the rest of your question.
It's okay, I did too.
What was it? What you asked? No, it was really important. I had a great answer that just went out of my head. Yeah, what was it?
He had a really good answer. Just let's assume that.
Oh, no, why I didn't make the case. Yes, why didn't I say what it was going to look like? Okay, all right, so.
Because you ran out of room, for one.
Right, I did run out of room. The thing is for me, like when I think about, actually like saying, okay, here's what a plan could be. Like, I approach this, I think about it, in much the same way I think about making the case. It's a journalistic challenge. So just as, I, would not have made the case for reparations by just, I don't know, like reading a bunch of briefings and then pulling it together and then writing a piece for the magazine. If I were to make the case for what, a reparations plan would look like I would want to go to South Africa and see, how did it work out? What did other countries do?
Would you rather have it, because part of this stuff.
Like I would want to report the thing out. Like you can't just, write an abstract.
He wants a ticket to South Africa.
I do want to. Yes, it is. And by the way, Eastern Europe too, where after the fall of communism, they open up the files, to see who's been spying on who, and people get to look at that. Did that solve anything? Did it make people feel any better?
Do you think we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? I mean, you could read this piece and say maybe the money piece of this is not the thing that's really bothering you.
The money's important, probably.
The money's important.
The money's important. The money's important.
Okay, how about money and a truth and reconciliation?
Right. I just want HR 40. I mean, I think people thought, like, are you just sort of quit at the end? No, we really do. Listen, you have to calculate up. And I mean this. Like, we have to figure, okay, we take, what? We had slavery in this country for 250 years. We had longer than we've had freedom for African Americans. That's how long. So we had that. And after that, we had basically 100 years of terrorism. Either the state was looking away or in some really egregious cases, the state was actually participating. You had job discrimination. You had housing discrimination. What about when Woodrow Wilson decides, hey, we're going to fire all the black federal employees, just clean that out. I mean, it's just so much. And then you have to pull all of that together and say, okay, what sort of bill? What's the bill for having done all of this? I mean, for basically allowing one class of people to plunder another, class of people. What's the bill, for instance, for the fact that for 5 years, effectively, we wrote Social Security so we could basically cut African Americans out, that we wrote unemployment that way, that we wrote welfare. It's quite a bit. And then we take that all together and we figure out what that is. I'm pretty sure we can't pay that number. But then we say, okay, what could we do? What could we do? And
reimagine housing in urban settings.
Yes. And I actually think that is a study. Like, I don't think, like, we could go off and do some sort of, do some sort of half-cock thing and, write it up. But I actually do think you need to approach that question like a journalist. And, look, just like, the first draft I turned into James and Scott, we had a brief mention, of the whole piece with German reparations to Israel. They said, no, you got to blow that out. Tell me what happened. Who are the characters? Give me some color. This back and forth. I mean, that's not just there for entertainment. It proves, the case, which is very, very important to me, that even when a crime is relatively recent, right, that don't make it not controversial. Sometimes the fact that it is recent makes it more controversial because of what you just said. I don't want to feel like, there's going to be blood money for somebody. But the recentness of it actually made it harder.
Right. Well, it's interesting because, we know that the majority of whites in this country are opposed to this, polls show that opposed to this kind of conversation happening. But we've also seen that 30% of African Americans asked don't want to have reparations.
Right.
What is... Describe a little bit, use the Israeli context for a second. Describe the opposition in Israel when the subject of reparations came up. And I'm wondering if there's an analog between what happened then in that controversy and something under the surface in the African-American community.
Right, I strongly suspect that, and I don't know because nobody's come up to me and said this yet, but I strongly suspect that there might be some sort of feeling of, you can't pay me off for what just happened here. I mean, there is recent stuff. I mean, there are people whose, parents were lynched who are still alive, you know what I mean, or grandkids or whatever. I mean, it wasn't, that long ago that there's nobody alive who, went through that. So I suspect there might be some resistance to that. But to be frank, I don't understand the African-American case against reparations. I don't, I'd love to hear it. Maybe one of our questioners will make it tonight.
Right.
But I don't have a good handle on it.
Right. No, it's something that I've realized in talking to you before this piece and after, there's this fundamental disconnect between my experience of America and your experience of America. I mean, when my ancestors got here, their lives got better. I mean, and that is true for every immigrant group, every voluntary immigrant group.
Right.
When your ancestors got here, it got worse.
Right.
It's a fundamental divide. And when you read your piece, which is written very strongly, you begin to wonder, do you admire the United States of America? Or is it so stained by sin that you can't feel a pride that people who came here and life got better for them would feel?
That I think is the, and somebody did make that critique, and that probably is like the hardest question to actually answer. And here's what I'll say. It's very interesting that, this will be a little bit, I'm thinking this through, so please be merciful on me. Obviously I am, predominantly of African ancestry, right? But, African Americans are melange. I mean, we kind of were created here, in a lot of ways. Obviously, we have roots, in our home, but, I haven't done the, the swab thing where you swab your cheek and you send it off and then...
Oh, I did, yeah.
Oh, you did do it? Okay,
yeah.
all right.
I'm from Ghana.
Okay, very shocking, right? Yeah. I kind of know what's going to come up, and it's not just going to be Ghana.
Yeah.
It's going to be some other places besides Ghana.
Poland.
Right. It could, God knows what else, maybe Ireland or something. But So, like we kind of, originate in this, this crime. It's the genesis, of African Americans here. And so, Jeff, I forgot the question again.
No, it's about how you feel about it.
Jesus, about how it's just jokes, man.
This is just the way he does questions.
Okay,
all right.
I'm so sorry. I get to talking and I get lost. No, okay, it's about how I feel. Right. How you feel.
How you feel.
Okay, so here's the thing.
The stain, the original sin, or the
This
stain.
is home. I mean, this is home, and this is going to be home,
Are there things about America that you're proud of?
Yeah, I really like Lincoln. I very, very much admire Lincoln. I think about a dude who was born, and people don't understand this. I mean, Lincoln's a total autodidact. I mean, in some shack in Kentucky, totally self-educated, becomes this beautiful writer, comes into the presidency feeling one way, is radicalized by the presidency, gives what I think is the most eloquent and most beautiful, inauguration, out of any inauguration in 1864, where he effectively calls the war, if he doesn't call it, reparation, he basically calls it divine punishment for 250 years, of what this country did, encourages folks to look at, the crime. I think, when you think about, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, when he says, so that freedom, will not perish from the earth, well, the thing to understand, democracy, America's not quite a democracy, in 1863. But in Europe at that time, you've had all these counter-revolutions. They're laughing at the idea. Even the theory, of rule by, actual, men and, women eventually, and all, that's laughable to them. And if you think about it, if the Civil War, if the secession, if the revolution actually succeeds, democracy has failed in this country. And the idea that African Americans, 200,000 of them end up, serving in the war, not only for their own liberation, but ultimately very much, saving even the theory of democracy for the Western world. How do we get out of this? I'm reading this great book right now by Henry Weinsack on George Washington and slavery. And he's going through how much of the soldiers, how many of the soldiers, or what percentage, what portion of the soldiers fighting in the Revolutionary War are African American. How do we get out of this? I mean, we're part of it, so I definitely have my days, when I'm angry, but it's your family. It's your family. I don't know how we get away from that. We got to deal with it. So I hope to improve it.
I was talking to your father before about this, and I'm curious to get your instant answer to this. If you were an adult in the 1960s, would you have been SCLC, SNCC, CORE, Black Panther, Nation of Islam, NAACP?
Well, here's the hard thing about that. Here's the hard thing about that. Here's the hard thing about that. My dad, and I think I got this right, he knocked on the door of the SCLC before he got to the, do I have that right? Before he got to the Black Panther Party. That's very interesting. So if somebody at the SCLC had been there, he might have been SCLC too. Okay. Right. Right, but I like to think I would have been like in my head,
by the way. I don't know if that's actually,
But when I was 14, I'd like to think I totally would have been, Black Panther, whatever. But no, when I talked to him, I had the great luxury of writing this memoir, which a lot of it was his story. And I think what people have to understand about African Americans at that age, and I'm even writing on this right now and thinking about this, the country's way of dealing with you is violence. That's just the way, the country's way of dealing with itself, of gaining its own freedom, is violence. And the way the country deals with African Americans is violence. Behind redlining, behind the actual policy, is the bombing, is the beating, is the riots. It's violence. And so if you are someone, who knows that about your country, who's gone off to, war, under the pretext of, being violent towards somebody else, in Vietnam, not quite understanding the cause, and you come back, not to, add on to that, the murder of somebody that's advocating for nonviolence, the response is to shoot him, to kill him. The response is for his government to bug his phones, and try to sabotage all his efforts, speaking, about Hoover and King, that your response might be violence too. Again, don't strike me as that radical. It's a very sensible, as far as I'm concerned, response.
Talk a little bit about the reaction to the piece, and divide it, if you will, between let's say white reactions. Let's say,
right. Let's say it could be anyone, right? It could be woman, man, right? Could be that.
Say a white person and a black person. I mean, what have been the responses to this? And is there a difference in tone or texture?
Yeah. So I think we always have these conversations about diversity in magazines, and one of the things I always talk about is being a kid well, not a kid, being a college student, and being a big reader of the New Republic, which I'm beating on the New Republic in every interview I've done. But this is like I was kind of scarred by this. Being a student at Howard University and reading the New Republic. Okay, I like that. HU. That's all right. Being a student at Howard University and being around so many just intelligent, different, varied African Americans, and then picking up, this magazine, which does what you hope to one day do, write these, little, opinionated, long-form articles with reporting, and watching them talk about black people, and like having no black people on staff, like no black people in the room, but just sort of theory. Do you think they're genetically stupid? You think that's what it is? Let me ask you, white guy over here. What do you think? You just read these articles. I mean, do you know the Stephen Glass article, Taxi Cabs? It's all about how black people are too lazy to be taxi cab drivers. And it ends with some black dude holding him up, in a taxi cab driven by, it's the perfect ending, for the theory. And you see this, who was, as you guys know, totally lying. And, it just fills you with so much anger. It filled me with so much anger that people could talk in these elite rooms about us as though we were not there, as though we were not even people, as though we were things, like you were discussing furniture or something, that could be shifted around. Honey, do you think the couch should be on this side of the room or that side of the room? As though we had nothing to say. Literally no black people working for them. And
if you want to attack other magazines, keep going. That's
right.
No, that's good.
Right. Now that was the big one. I mean, there was other ones that did it, right? But that was just so huge. And so, like, even going into the field, I thought about that a lot. I say that to say, African Americans see that. We saw that. We were watching that. The flip side of that, if we can be self-congratulatory for a moment here, is when you see the Atlantic do something like this, take this idea. Listen, if you're black, whether you're for reparations or not, in the back of your mind, these cats owe you something. This was not magic. You didn't end up here by magic. And that's like in the background, in every, you did something to me. And I know it. I mean, we agree we're not going to talk about this. We're going to have a very nice conversation. But you did something to me. And I know it too. You know it too. And that's in the background. And to see, like the Atlantic, to put it on the cover in the way they did, right? To do a trailer, do these films, like treat it like a serious issue and say, you know what? Yeah, we did. We did, and we should fix it. I think it's filled a lot of African Americans with a great deal of joy because the responses I'm getting, are not about me. People come up to me and they're just really joyous. I mean, from the African American perspective, and I think like that, that backstory is there. The white perspective has been much more, interesting and unpredictable. But it's been good. It's been good. I was on the train and I was talking to, Isabel Wilkerson, who wrote this great book, The Warmth of Other Suns, which I always say was really was the mother of this piece. And there's just there's so much horror in that book. It's a great book, but there's so much horror being done. And I was telling her that the most common reaction I get from white people is, I had no idea. I had no idea. I had no idea. And I think that's actually a sincere reaction. Who talks about redlining? Who talks about housing segregation as the root of all this? Who talks about, if I'm completely honest, I had some idea, but I definitely didn't have a total swath of it. I didn't understand it was that bad, And so I think, if anything, there's a kind of relief, like, oh, now I understand. I understand why, I can look at it and I don't have to go through this thing where I, feel like it can't be that they're biologically inferior, but maybe they are. Like I don't have to do that. Like, oh, okay, this makes sense. So, it's been a kind of relief from a lot of white people.
I've been in the South all week, and I was with a couple of Southern politicians, progressive politicians.
That's like 3 people.
What?
So now you're in trouble.
They call that small group libel. You can figure out who it was.
Right. Because they're not black, right? They're not black, right?
No. It's not so easy to find black politicians sometimes in the South. But I was talking about this piece with one of these guys, and
now we know it's a dude.
What?
Now we know it's a dude.
Well, it doesn't narrow it down that much more. And he was the mayor of a big city. So what else do you want to know, right? Yeah. But there are couple of things that struck me. I mean, and this is talking to more than just one politician. There might be A, sympathy with the overarching theme, B, a kind of, not contempt, but a kind of, give me a break, we're never going to do this, so why bother talking about it? And then there's this other piece, and you've written about this, Bill Cosby, and you've written about President Obama in this, and this came up, it's like, it's the culture question, you know, it's like, while you eggheads, this guy kept referring to, I was playing the role of you in the argument, and he kept referring to you as your friend, you know, because he probably couldn't pronounce your name.
Did he try?
What?
Did he try?
Ta-Nehisi.
Yeah, okay. That's close. That's close.
But he was talking about, he said, okay, fine, you eggheads keep debating, you know, some structural changes in America that will take 50 years to accomplish, and by the way, 90% of whites would be against you anyway, because that chapter is over and we have affirmative action and equality. Fine, well, you do that. We have these terrible problems in our cities that we have to deal with, and that is children growing up without fathers, and drugs, and all of the issues, the pathologies that are talked about. Talk about, because this is one of the most interesting parts of your piece, your critique of Michael Nutter, the mayor of Philadelphia, who's African American. Bill Cosby. You see this. Morgan Freeman just had a thing last week where he says, "I don't know what." Essentially, I don't know what black people are complaining about anymore. We have equality. You can do whatever you want. Look at me. And because he said it, no, it's interesting because he said it in the Morgan Freeman voice. It has like
it sounded like God.
Yeah, no, it's like God or the president or something. Sounding like it.
We got to get him to read the case for reparations out loud.
Yeah. He should do the audio book. He won't agree with you apparently. But that would be great to have him do the audio.
I know it'd be awesome.
That would be great.
So I'm going to try to take this in 3 parts and remember each part.
Yeah.
Okay. The first part is, you know, the practicality argument, I think, reflects a very, very narrow view of politics. And if if we read, the history of politics in this country, we understand that. In the 1850s, I won't have it right, or maybe even 40s, when you had the Seneca Valley Convention, there was strong argument about whether there should be advocacy for the right of women to vote. I mean, this was a back and forth. It was seen as too radical, too crazy. What if we decide to not, put that up there because it was, too radical? Let's not advocate for it now. In 1857, when this magazine is formed, as we were talking about in the car, Lincoln is running away from, he don't want nothing to do with the abolitionists. He don't want nothing to do with social equality, as they called it at the time, between black and white people. They branded the Republican Party, they used to call it the Black Republican Party. That was how they referred to it, Lincoln and his Black Republican Party.
We've come a long way, baby.
Right, yes we have. Yeah, because they don't call it that anymore. Right. But they call it, the Black Republican Party. Does that mean Frederick Douglass should not have advocated for, abolition? And it was clearly, something that, most people thought was a really, really radical idea. Politics is not, does not end with the, can we break the filibuster or not? It doesn't end at the ballot box. Politics is a broad process, and somebody got to work on the ends of imagination, of political imagination, and that's where writers live. Second portion of that is, I resent the connotation of being some, disinterested egghead, because I don't work on the realms of, political. I'm a very interested egghead. I live right now, I guess I shouldn't say this. I live in Harlem. I won't get exact. I was going to give my corner. I won't do that. My wife would be very upset. I live in Harlem. I have a son who lives in Harlem right now who, has to, walk the streets, who I think about all the time. This is not a disinterested question for me. When my story came out, my mother called me up and said, I'm going to tell you a story. And I hadn't even made the connection. She said, I'm going to tell you a story. Your grandmother, you remember the house on Pennhurst? That was a house, my grandmother had. Yes, I did. I went to that house all the time when I would, get off from elementary school, would walk to that house. And she said, your grandmother called me and she said, we have to settle on the house. Will you and your sister come? And my mother said, well, what do you mean you own the house? Well, she didn't own the house. She bought it on contract. So we are not, African Americans are not disinterested. This is actually a really, really, I won't analogize too much, but you are not a disinterested observer in anti-Semitism or the legacy of the Holocaust. No, it's very, very real for you. And you know people who actually went through it, just like I do. It's around us. So it's not like, up here, we are the constituents of people who say things like that. You know, and I think I could hazard to say that I'm, you know, much more affected, you know, as an African American by the problems that, you know, this, you know, unnamed Southern politician is trying to address, you know, than he is. You know, that's not to, you know, impugn his sincerity at all. You know, I'm just saying this is not a, you know, a disinterested conversation. The third piece of this is the one about, you know, personal responsibility and culture. We have been having this conversation in the African American community for a very, very long time. You can go back to W.E.B. Du Bois. You can look at, you know, the speeches of, you know, Marcus Garvey, who says it is often, you know, a black man who, you know, is given the injury to black people more than it's white people. You can go through the speeches of Malcolm X. I am all for agency. I am all for self-determination. If you have any sort of see any sort of conversation between me and my son, you know, that's going to be stressed. But when you are an official, when you're a governmental official, you don't just, you know, represent, you know, you right now. You represent, you know, your city, your state, your country, and you bring with it all of its heritage and all of its legacy. Housing segregation is something that cities, states, and this country did. You're the embodiment of that. You know, just like, you know, when you stand up, you know, if you're, you know, mayor of this unnamed, you know, city or politician of this unnamed, I'm getting close, am I? I'm sorry about that. I'm trying here. If you represent, you represent this unnamed progressive, you know, place in the South, you represent all of the heritage, because when you stand up, you give lectures about the, you know, the history and the heritage that go way back. Guess what? This is part of it too. You did this thing. You're part of it. You're responsible for it. And when governmental officials stand up and make that case, you know, I have no problem, you know, reminding them that, listen, you can't, especially when black politicians do it, you can't be black part of the time. You know, now you want to be the, you know, just the, you know, mayor, you know, of all the people of Philadelphia. You want to be, you know, in the case of our president, and this is a very mild critique that I'll make, you know, you want to be president of all the people of the United States. That's fine.
Do you think black politicians are saying, you know, as Nutter said, you know, just pull up your pants and go to... Do you think they're saying that in order to ingratiate themselves with...
No, because I think a lot... No, maybe partially, yeah. But at the same time, I don't want to diminish the fact that when they do that, they are primarily talking to African-American audiences, and there are a lot of African-Americans, and I feel it, who are frustrated. And it is, I'll just say, it is a thing to walk out of your house, as I have done many times, at 7 in the morning to get your butt to work and see some dudes hanging on the corner and to come back and see the same dudes. It will raise your temperature a bit. It will raise your temperature.
When you see
and sometimes
that,
we speak out of that.
This is the byproduct of 250 years of slavery.
No, you don't say that at all. No, you say, what are you doing, man? What are you doing? What's your problem? You know, you use some much more colorful language. I mean, you just, you know, you curse, you know, it's very upsetting. It's very, very upsetting, and it's frustrating. So I'm not, you know, I am not alien to that feeling. It's a very, very frustrating feeling. And I think if you're like the President of the United States, where, listen, this is a cat who was born in Hawaii, who had to deal with fatherlessness. And then you come to the south side of Chicago, and one of your great connections to the African American community in that place is fatherlessness too. That's got to make you feel a certain way. I mean, it's frustrating. It's really, 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 really frustrating, and it makes you angry. And I understand when folks speak out about that. I think policymakers have a different job. And I think the question is, you know, to what extent are we doing catharsis, and to what extent are we making policy? It was policy that got us, you know, redlining. It was policy that got us housing segregation. Enslavement was policy. There's policy behind all this. Slave trade was policy, you know? And so when that becomes a substitute for something, you know, I don't know, I have a problem with it. The other piece of this is, listen, we have tons of academic research on the impact of redlining, on the impact of not being able to get the GI Bill, on the impact of lynching, on the impact of terrorism, on the impact of... We got tons of academic literature on what that did and what that does to community. Culture, not so much. Not so much. It's a little harder to quantify. So why do we spend so much time talking about the thing that we have the hardest time quantifying, and so little time talking about the thing that we know? We know what redlining is. It's very clear. It's right there. It's not a mystery.
We're going to go to questions after one more round, so there's some mics. You might want to even start lining up now. But just let's stay on President Obama, because you know, you've had an interesting and fraught public relationship with him.
We have a relationship.
You have a very close relationship.
Glad to know that.
You have an intellectual relationship. In my mind, you have an intellectual relationship with him.
I'll take that.
Yeah, take it. He is coming into the last quarter of his presidency. He's the first African-American president. He has overwhelming support in the African-American community. There's also a good level of, not unhappiness, but discontent or a little bit of sadness that maybe he hasn't pushed some ideas that... One question I have for you is sort of armchair, it's almost like armchair psychologist.
Yeah.
Do you think that knowing everything that you do about the president, and you've written about him a ton, you've read everything that he said about this subject, do you think that he would be sympathetic to this general notion of some kind of public discussion about what America owes African Americans today, and then carry that through? Do you think that once he is liberated from the November midterm elections and he has no more races to worry about, do you think that there's any chance that he would move his agenda more in alignment with, let's say, what mainstream African Americans want from the government?
I think, well, the first thing I'll say is I think having the task of navigating this country as the first African-American president is extremely, extremely fraught. And I think he's about the only person alive that could do it, and I mean that, like I sincerely mean that. I actually think he's done a pretty, given what the challenge was, I actually think he's done and I say that even with all my critique, I think he's actually done a pretty remarkable job. The first statement when Trayvon Martin, not when he was killed, but when, it became, such a big thing. You had all these protests and, we didn't know if George Zimmerman was going to get arrested, was a really, really deft statement. Now, people still went crazy, but it was a remarkably deft statement.
People went so crazy, he might have been scared by how crazy it got.
Right. No, it was pretty amazing to watch. The statement that he gave after the verdict came down was, it was remarkable. It was really, and I thought, he had this ability, to really, go between, two poles and not too much, sacrifice. I put it to you like this. If I wanted somebody to explain how African Americans felt to the rest of the country, I don't think it could have been done too much better. So, I'll say that. I think it'd be a bad idea for the president to come out for reparations. I think that's that doesn't reflect how movements get, built and how they get kickstarted.
For a white president to come out for it.
Maybe.
Why not?
Maybe.
No, seriously, why not? If you want
that's a great point.
If you want to mainstream this idea,
eventually,
who's going to mainstream?
Yeah. Well, I think what you need to do is you need to build a movement. I think that's the first thing. I think you did. This is a ground-up thing, not a top-down thing. And I'm definitely not a black president, maybe not a white president. I think it just instantly polarizes things. No, definitely not that either. No. Not that either. Not that either. None of that's good. None of that'll work. All that's bad. But I think it's like, what you need people educated first. Listen, a universe in which like a HR 40 passes, where we say, okay, we're going to have a study. That's the John Conyers bill for the study, is a very, very different universe than we have right now. So it's not like, just to reply to your progressive Southern politician, it's not like, he has to deal with the politics as they are right now, right? But part of the way the politics of right now get formed is people write articles about what the politics should be. That's the way it works. That's the way it works. So if he wants a different politics, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, he should hope that people, eggheads, make the case for a different sort of politics. That's how ideas advance in a society. They don't start with the people, at a voting booth. Voting is very important, but if you limit it right there, well then, we'll have nothing. That basically cuts out the entire civil rights movement. Martin Luther King wasn't in office, that basically says, well, it's just, Lyndon Johnson and that's it. So I think you need, a critical mass first, and then, we can talk about presidential politics after that. All
right. Why don't we just go right to questions right here, and then we'll just go back and forth. And please ask them in the form of a question. He's nice, but I'll cut you off.
Understood. Thank you both for the wonderful discussion. I was wondering if you could comment on this idea of the historical debt. My own family, I look like it, grew up in the radical Mexican-American tradition, and what I see is sort of an analog, and one of the great things about your piece, about it expanding the ideas of the political boundaries, I see is the whole debate that's been, of course, completely cut out, which is the idea of open borders, which is considered a crazy idea.
Open what?
Open borders.
Okay.
And I look at that, and the reason I mention that is that in the same vein that we have a history of housing discrimination and slavery, this systematic way in which we keep out people we don't want in this country has similarly hurt people of, you know, unfortunate backgrounds. And I was just wondering if you could comment on that, if you see a parallel there, because I know personally I see it, and I think that there are people.
No, I think so. You know, I made the case. I hope
if you answer this question the wrong way, you're going to lose your Republican primary.
Right. I know. Yes, I know. Right. It's in trouble. Right.
Just understand that.
Worry about that.
Just understand that. Right.
Worry about that. I made the case. I hope that's not the end of the conversation. You know, what I can do is make the case for the thing that I've researched the most from. My hope is that other people will see that as inspiration, and you know, if folks see parallels and want to make the parallel in a deep way, not in a cheap way, not in a yeah, but what about us sort of way, but in an actual detailed policy, this happened here sort of way, I think that would be remarkable. One of the questions I get asked all the time, yeah, but what about Native Americans? I would love nothing more than to see an argument for reparations for Native Americans. Let's see that too. But the argument's got to be made. Like, you got to actually make the argument. You can't just say it as a way of just sort of, changing the subject. And I think like one of the dangers that, progressives fall into is, because it's natural to have this sort of coalition politics, you can't paper over differences. I mean, there are real differences, in people's experiences, and that should be respected, and it should be written about in that particular way.
Go ahead.
My question is about the South. You guys gave some ribbing to the Southerners, and I don't think it is that hard to find progressives in the South. And in fact, I think that I'm from North Carolina right now. There's a Moral Monday movement happening there that's being led by the Reverend William Barber out of Goldsboro, and it's a broad coalition of blacks, whites, gays, lesbians, and he's very inclusive in his sermons. And I think this is a Southern issue, and I just wonder what role you think the South is going to play in this, and especially given that progressive Southerners are who led the Civil Rights Movement in the first place.
Well, I'm sorry, what's the question?
Well, I'm just wondering, like, I think the South does have a role to play here.
I love the South.
All right, there you go.
South's awesome.
First of all,
I love
yes,
Southern progressives too.
Well, I just think that there's this argument resonates particularly in the South, and I feel like there's more of a listening for it actually than maybe in the North, where these things
You said there's what more than in the North?
More of a listening for it in the South than might be expected, I guess, because there is a tradition of progressive activism in the South.
I'm so sorry, I'm not getting the question.
No, it's like, so is there, the question is, do you agree
I'm not trying to be disrespectful at all either.
No, there's a progressive movement in the South that wants to talk about this issue?
I wonder if you think, yes, exactly. I wonder if you think that, I mean...
Yeah, no, and I'm sorry, we're up here making jokes amongst each other. I didn't know we meant to slight, progressives in the South. I hope so. I really hope so, One of the dangers, I will say this, when you have a conversation like this, is, and this is why we went to Chicago, is people think it's just the South. They think, it's just happened here, and, you get people that say dumb things all the time, on my blog, like, we should have let them secede, or we should just cut the South off, just the worst, sort of things in the world. Anyway, yes. I think progressives in the South are awesome, and I hope they'll support HR 40.
So you do like the South, is what you're saying?
Yes, I do like the South. Yes.
I mean, I don't know if there's a corollary to this, but one of the most astonishing numbers in American politics is the percentage of white males in Mississippi who voted for Obama,
right,
which I believe is 7%.
Right.
I mean, so it's and 8 of those were medical professors or something,
Right. It's like Oxford,
Yeah. No, so I mean, it does strike me that that you might have a harder slog in many parts of the South than in some others. Yeah, over here. Yes, thank you. You can lower that.
I loved what you said about being disinterested and how that's a powerful position from which to write and to advocate. I was wondering if, as a black man who often writes about race and racism, you've ever been dismissed, especially when you're trying to get something published. Your perspective has ever been dismissed as too disinterested, and if so, how you have clearly maneuvered beyond that, because wonderfully you get to write about this stuff all the time. But I was just curious. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, when I was younger and I freelanced, you know, it's always tough. I mean, freelance is such a tough game. You can't really tell, are you being dismissed because, you know, you're talking about something black, or are you just being, because there's so many people getting dismissed. I mean, dismissal is like the condition of a freelance writer. So, I mean, with one exception, which I won't highlight, you really, I should highlight it, because it's how I ended up at the Atlantic.
New Republic.
No, it wasn't the New Republic. It was somebody else. It was another magazine. Oh, it's how I ended up at the Atlantic. I got laid off. This is a great story. I got laid off at Time magazine, and I had started this, I started this story about Bill Cosby. And I don't know if James remembers this, and the best thing about getting fired from a magazine is you get to take all your reporting with you. So I had all of this reporting, but I had nowhere to place it, and I wrote somebody that I knew at a magazine. They said, this is very interesting, let me take it to the top editor. And they came back and they said, man, this is horrible. They said, yeah, this was cool, but they said, we would only do this if it was somebody like Henry Louis Gates that did it. Which is probably the most, like the only rejection I ever got. It was like, okay, all right, that's what that is. But what happened was I then went, to, another, mutual friend of ours, and I said, look, I got this rejection. Is there any way I could take this? And he said, I know this guy, James Bennett. And, there it is. That was the end of it. And that was the first story. That was it, yeah.
But would you prefer more white people writing about this issue?
Yes, I actually would. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for provoking this discussion. I'd like to expand on what Jeffrey mentioned about what Michael Nutter said and other politicians about the black family. From my experience in Louisiana teaching black kids and tutoring black kids in D.C., from my experience, what is missing is the father and the nuclear family. And if you go back to the early 1900s, you realize that the vast majority of black children were born in wedlock. You realize that the vast majority of families had a mother and a father. I'm wondering where we can situate that historical reality, which occurred up until the 1960s, and then it, out of wedlock births spiked for blacks and whites. What is the importance of that historical reality within your larger narrative of restitution?
So the two things that are really important here, and I noticed that I have the data on my site. If you had looked at African-American families in, say, 1890, African-American families always, had a higher percentage where the father wasn't there. That was true. Something happened in this country, and other people can disentangle what that was, and we had more single-parent families, period. In America, period. This is just true. Right now, the percentage of families in this country where there's a single mother is exactly where it was in the 1960s when it was blamed on a tangle of pathologies. It's exactly where it was where black people were right then. Nobody thinks the white family is afflicted by a tangle of pathologies. So I think it's very, very important that we be clear about the language that we're using here. The other thing that we have to ask ourselves, okay, why? Why? Might this have any relationship to the fact that African-American males represent some minuscule population of humans on the planet Earth, but 8% of the incarcerated population on the planet Earth? Is that, that's what we're asking. Where are the men? Are those two things related? Is it possible? When you have like 1 in 3, who are going to go through a system like that. So, listen, I'm all fine having that argument. I wrote an entire book about, I grew up in West Baltimore. First memoir is about the importance of fathers, about my father, about the difference of not having a father around. But it's like, we want to have that like as though it's not connected to something that America did. That's the problem. As though there's no sort of policy conversation. If your argument is we need more fathers in the home, hey, I'm with you. But then we got to say why.
Is there a reason why that didn't get included in your story, though? I was waiting for that, but...
Because I've written about it so much. I can't keep arguing about it. Like at some point, and that's the selfish portion. Some of it is for you. I've written, if you want to see it on the blog, I've written about it. I got charts, datas up to yin yang. I've done it so much. You can't keep saying the same thing.
Thank you.
Even if I got to say it here.
Over here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
In that Bill Cosby story, by the way, too, it's in there. It's all there.
My question is about the African in America. So I know that your narrative focuses mostly on the past 100 years or so, a little bit even 70s and onwards, right? So the African in America, I'm talking about Muhammad, who lives in Southeast DC, who's had, pretty much the same experiences as the African American, but did not have that slavery narrative and doesn't come from that background. Is he considered as part of this reparations story, or does he not count in that? His children go to Ballou High School. He lives in Southeast. He experiences the same discriminations, but where does he fall in this narrative?
I don't know. And it's a complicated question because, the easy thing to do for African Americans is I can look at, all the redlining maps in the country and say, okay, who lived there, who lived there, who lived there, and we could, make a pretty, direct claim. And that becomes harder with people who came here, on a more recent basis. At the same time, I was looking at some data, relatively recently, and if you look at, if you compare, say, immigrants who come here from Africa, or immigrants who come here from the Caribbean, and you compare, the first generation very much outperforms, native African Americans. You start looking at their children, and you compare their children to Asian immigrants, and you see them quickly becoming black like everybody else. Mm-hmm. So, there's a really, really complicated conversation to be had there, which is why we need a study.
Can I just piggyback on that for 1 second? Because one of the critiques of our mutual colleague, David Frum, who we've been having a back and forth with on the Atlantic website is, and I'm going to caricature it a little bit, but it's, okay, but this falls apart in practice because what about Colin Powell? What about Eric Holder from Barbados? What about, I mean, how do you start like sort of dividing up America in these subcategories?
Right. Well, yeah, you do. I mean, you're going to have to do some division anytime you do any, I mean, that's part of what the government does, right? I mean, Social Security, there's a subcategory of people who get that. So that's, I'm not being flippant. I mean, there's going to be some amount of who gets what and who doesn't. Two things. I mean, I think this is like really, really important. There's a lot of history in that piece. And I think, how to be nice.
Don't bother.
A lot of people think they're equipped to have this conversation and they are not. And I'm just gonna I just want to be really clear about this. Anyone who has read Colin Powell's biography, there's an entire section where he talks about experiencing segregation. Colin Powell did not appear when he became head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That's not how it happened. Eric Holder's family, you're right, their lineage is Caribbean, but his family was here in the 1960s and the 1950s. They were here. They didn't arrive here. Eric Holder didn't appear as whatever. What was his position when he was in the assistant attorney general, whatever he was in the. He didn't just suddenly appear. So and it's very, very important. It's really, really important that if we're going to have this fight, that folks educate themselves on the history. You can oppose reparations all you want, right? But you got to know the facts. I mean, you really, really do. And I don't want to single anybody out, in that. But I'm just going to say that we don't understand how much we don't understand. And it's quite a bit. It's really, really quite a bit. I think when people think, well, you're just advocating another study because you're punting. No, you just have no idea how much you don't know. We just don't. It's quite a bit.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So first of all, thank you for initiating a much-needed conversation about reparations on a national level. It's, in my opinion, a no-brainer. But there was one part of your piece that troubled me near the end, and it's the part where you present reparations paid by Germany to Israel in the 1950s as a model for the United States. And I'm just curious if you're aware that those reparations financed Israel's mass dispossession and ghettoization of Palestinians. And since you brought Israel into the conversation, I'm also wondering if you think that the United States, hold on, let me finish. I'm also wondering if you think the United States should pay Palestinians reparations for its role in financing their occupation and dispossession to the tune of $3.1 billion every single year. And don't you think that money would be better spent on reparations for Black Americans? And then for Jeffrey Goldberg, you admitted...
No, you gotta let me answer. You gotta let me answer. Come on, I'll answer. I'll gladly answer. I'll gladly answer.
I've been on this.
I'll gladly answer.
Everybody else got a chance to... Everybody else
so many times talking about Palestinian stuff. We're going to talk about...
Let me answer, please. Can I answer?
I'm just curious because you brought it into the conversation. I'm not bringing it into the conversation. You didn't. I think it's a legitimate question.
Can I answer? Can I answer, though?
Go ahead.
I'd love to answer. I think the important thing to understand about this is reparations is not a solution for every problem. It's not like, if African Americans got reparations, everything about America would be solved. The question in terms of, Israel and reparations, was it deserved? That really was the question that I was trying, was it deserved? What happened after that, is a conversation that should be had, right? But that doesn't mean that reparations, therefore, weren't deserved. You can say, well, they, weren't particularly just or didn't do this, didn't do that with the reparations, but that doesn't address the question, was it deserved and how was it paid out? That was the way I was coming at it. And, should African Americans get reparations? There's no guarantee that, we're going to, therefore be any more just with anybody else. But that doesn't, then you can't then argue backwards and say, therefore, it doesn't make it deserved or not.
Wait,
I'm not saying it does not deserve. I'm just
because I can't help myself sometimes. No, but it's interesting talking about facticity of an issue. Reparations by Germany were paid in good part. Some went to the government of Israel, but billions of dollars went to individuals who were slave laborers, individuals who had their property sold. So, I mean, it's not just a question of West Germany to Israel. It was about Germany to individual Jews in a lot of cases, which is what we're talking about.
Okay, well, in the piece it was a little different. In the piece it was presented as a model giving reparations to a state.
I think you just answered why it's a model.
Okay, well, what I'm saying is it's bizarre it strikes me as bizarre to use this as a model when those reparations were used to dispossess another people.
Well, it's bizarre if you think reparations is going to solve everything. If you think it'll bring total justice, it's bizarre then,
This is what always happens at Sixth and I. It always becomes about the West Bank. No. And I appreciate that, but there are a lot of people waiting to ask questions. So let me just go over here if I can.
Well, I just actually had one more question for you.
Ma'am,
you can't cut.
Seriously. There's like 20 people who want to ask questions to Ta-Nehisi, so please. Go ahead, sir.
Okay. How you doing? So
if you talk about the Gaza Strip, I swear to God.
No, I won't do that. So I'm an educator and a playwright, and I've been working on a play called Reparations, the Musical for... Wait, hold up. This is so funny because you all get it. A lot of people don't get it because I got to explain a lot, Reparations the Musical, right? You got to explain it because it's an oxymoron for a lot of people. So I changed the title to just Reparations. Then I don't have to explain, but it's still a musical.
I'm trying to write songs in my head as you speak, by the way.
But not so much, right? So here's what's interesting about what you said earlier. You and when I started doing research for the piece, and I talked to people about reparations, they would squawk at the idea because I discovered they didn't have the facts and the information, and I initially didn't have it either. I was amazed at the atrocities that happened, so many stories and tragedies and triumphs in this whole struggle for liberation for people of African descent.
Can we move to a question?
I'm trying to.
Okay.
So I did a reading in New York, and it was a debate on reparations, and people got it, walked out like, give them reparations. Yes, right. So here's my question for you. No, come see my play. No, no, really. So really, do you actually think we're going to get reparations without a mass movement that may require bloodshed?
Wow.
Could that lady with the Palestinians come back?
Maybe not. But if you get reparations with bloodshed, you'll get a lot of other things that are not so good. You'll get a lot worse things. Maybe not. Maybe not. I don't know. I have no idea. All I can do is look at a problem, diagnose it, and say, this is what I think we should do. What happens after that, I have no idea. There may never be reparations. I just don't know. I would hope it would not be bloodshed. But if it comes to that, I mean, if it ever, in that world, whatever that world is, that's a bad world. That's a bad world, because it'll mean a lot of other things came with it. It won't be romantic.
Over here, sir. Yes.
Hi. So first off, I'm a sociologist in training, so I thank you for all the dedication and attention to the research that we so often do that gets neglected sometimes. So thank you. It's a really good job on that. So kind of in that vein, you've talked about all the research that's been done by sociologists and historians and economists on all the things that have happened, all the redlining, all the housing discrimination, all of that. But part of what is happening when you're asking and talking about reparations is, this reckoning. It's not just a repayment of money and property, but it's also, HR 40 is attempting to have this conversation about what it means to kind of bring a sense of justice back into this equation. And so, it's kind of like, blacks and whites in this country are like a married couple, and they've been battling. It's been an abusive relationship. It's been, there's been, a very bad abusive relationship. And so, in thinking about it that way, you can pay out money to kind of deal with some of the wealth inequalities, but how do you repay trust, right? So there's research on...
Is that the question?
Why don't we just get to the question?
Yeah. That's a very good question. Yeah. You start by paying the money. I mean, it don't solve, to hazard this, to, go back to the Israel comparison, though, I think is actually, a good one. The question I often think about that, let's consider a world where Germany does nothing. Let's consider a world where Germany makes no sort of recompense, never says sorry, never does anything. What would trust be like then? Trust, it may not be perfect now, but what would it be like then? So I don't know that, you ever healed a thing totally. It's an injury. You may always walk with a limp. It may just be, something that's true of your society. But it can be better than this. It can be better than this. I don't know that you get total trust back. I don't know that you ever get that. But it could be better than this. And, I think that's the way we got to look at it.
Thank you for coming. My question concerns your sort of direction from here on out. I imagine, politicians may not be interested, but I imagine there are a lot of people who would be interested in having you sort of out in front on sort of micro scale, sort of politically cuddly initiatives like increasing the amount of deference that's given to wealth inequalities and affirmative action, for example. Is that something that you actively want to see get involved in, or you want to be the big picture?
No. I love my job. I'm a writer. And I'm not an activist, and I don't mean that with any, I definitely don't mean that with any disdain, towards activists. I'm not a politician. I have no disdain for politicians, but, I think there has to be some respect, for what, a journalist or a writer's role is within a democracy. And I really, really enjoy it. I get great thrill out of it. It's not a platform to go do something else. I'm thinking, and we were talking about it yesterday, I'm thinking about the next story. I mean, that really is what I'm thinking about. That does not mean that I don't care about it, but, I gotta play my role. I can't be out there being, I mean, you advocate for something in your journalism, but you really kind of got to watch that. You got to make sure that you're really serving the story.
Thank you. You would be really good in Reparations, the musical, though.
Yeah, I think you'd
Hi. So just a really quick question. You've talked in the past, in previous writing online, about a journey, excuse me, an intellectual journey from black nationalism to humanism.
Yeah.
And I think you referenced it as, like, in the beginning, thinking that people who wanted to be humanists, like, didn't want to be black, which is sort of an intellectual journey that I can relate to as well. Want to know, can you talk a little bit about that intellectual movement? And
right.
Two, can you talk about how it was reflected in this piece?
Well, one of the funny things is like I was raised close to it, but not quite, in close proximity to black nationalism. My dad, my parents, they were always a little heterodox, so never quite, as it, and it never quite leaves you. It's like being a Christian. Like, you can walk away from the church, but it's still kind of like with you. And that was the story I was telling about the article. It's still there to some extent. At the same time, one of the things that happened to me in the course of this reading was understanding the way, even the terminology we use, so, people say, well, what does Ta-Nehisi do? He writes about race, right? That's what he writes about. even that terminology gets something wrong, something that we've embraced, and that is that race is an actual thing. I'm a member of the black race, and Jeff is a member of the white race, and that's the terminology.
Slow down.
Okay, sorry about that. And I mean, to put this in perspective, at one point it would have been Jewish race. Like, that was a word that people, a way people talk. An Italian race, an Irish race, a Nordic race, a French race. You can, James McPherson has this great article on the Civil War, and the Southerners were literally saying they are a Southern race. They're somehow different than Northerners. And one of the things I had to understand that as is a kind of creation of racism. The idea that you belong to a race, and therefore that justifies everything. That the way in action, racism is something that's done, that you do something to people. You redline people, you lynch people, you segregate people, and you do that for reasons of power. And that becomes clear, when you start looking at the history. African Americans, I'm sorry, not African Americans, what we would call black people today are regarded one way if you look at the art history, for instance, in Europe, and they're regarded a total other way after the slave trade starts happening. That's when you start getting a reification of folks being a race. And once I got that, you kind of made it hard to think about myself. And what I realized was that African Americans aren't people, though, there are things about being black that I really, really like. That we have ethnic traditions, that we have culture, that we have shared history, that there's a certain way of being, when we're all together that, is very, very different, and at the same time is, pretty much very similar when you look at, various ethnicities. And so one of the things that, I had to reconcile was my deep, deep pride in being an African American, and being a black person, and being rooted in that, and at the same time getting away from this sort of essentialist notion of who I was, as though it was somehow, deep, deep in my DNA or something.
Okay.
Are you cutting us off?
Unfortunately, we are running out of time. We'll take 2 more questions from each microphone, and then just a reminder to the audience, please stay seated at the end of the program until our guests can make their way backstage.
Could one more from each? Okay.
So,
do you want to go out in front of him?
Is he in line?
Okay. Because you're so nice, you're also going to get a question. You get the bonus question behind him, but go ahead, young man.
Hi. So I was listening earlier, and you said that we should be kind of, as African Americans, we should be paid back in a way, but I mean...
Wait, we should be what?
Get kind of paid back, as in... But I mean, the obvious thing we would try to do is money, but as you know, we're in a $17 trillion debt. So... what else? What do you think we should do?
Wait, I'm sorry.
What do you think we should get?
What would it look like?
Yeah. Yeah. Other forms of
okay.
restitution.
Well, I mean, I think the main guy who I profile in the story, Mr. Clyde, he deserves a check. He should get a check. And there are African Americans, like that who, really deserve a check, who were directly subjected individually to housing discrimination. You could, for instance, set up a claim office, right? The GI Bill was written a certain way. Power devolved down to local officials. And it was written that way specifically because it was known that, if you were going, say, into your Veteran Affairs office in Mississippi, the likelihood of you being able to get a home loan, the likelihood of you being able to get an educational loan was significantly diminished, okay? So we could, easily set up a claim office for people who are directly affected. That doesn't get us all the way there, though. Another way of thinking about it is in terms of communities, because, whole neighborhoods are affected. And we can come up with any variety of programs to do more investment, in these neighborhoods, in a neighborhood like North Lawndale, where I was, which is, again, I hate to beat the same drum, why we need a study, to figure out what, programs would be best and what, would not be best. I don't think, and I understand your question about the debt, right? But we make decisions in this country about what we're going to do and what we're not going to do. When we decide that, we're going to, say, invade another country, we go do it. We go do it. And no one wants to hear any sort of conversation about, a debt or anything like that. When we decided we wanted to pay back bankers, not pay back bankers, but rescue bankers, excuse me, not pay back, we did it. We did it. We have enormous power. This is the country that, came up with the atomic bomb. I mean, and that's been our calling card. We do the impossible, right? Well, I mean, come on. Reparations, really that impossible? Really? I mean, given everything else, I mean, we, created the Erie Canal. Innovation is what we do. And we tell everybody that. We go around the world, we advertise ourselves as the great innovators. Well, let's innovate here too, God,
thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for asking the question. So I want to go here, and then I'll give you the question because you were online.
There are 2 points I'd like to make. First, I'd like to thank...
Please ask a question.
Please ask a question.
Well, okay. My question is, you seem to marginalize the African slave, descendants of African slaves, by equating a Colin Powell or Barack Obama or anybody else who, or Eric Holder with descendants of African slaves. You go to great extent in your article to track the fact that this wealth was generated through slavery. You say that, and you convince me that these are the people who suffered and did the things that made this country rich. Now, the question I would like to pose to you is, then why shouldn't we limit the reparations to descendants of African slaves?
Well, I mean, I answered a question like that earlier, and I don't think...
No, you didn't answer.
Oh, actually, I did. I talked about Eric Holder, and I talked about Colin Powell as being here, you know, during segregation. And can I answer?
Sure.
Let me answer. I mean, if you look at the article, the wealth, the plunder, as I talk about it doesn't end in slavery. I mean, if you talk about a system, like we keep using this term, red line, we keep talking about housing segregation, African Americans, whether they were descendants of slaves or not, in 1900, are pledging fealty to a state. They're saying, you know, we're going to obey the same laws that everybody else is going to. We're going to pay our taxes in the same way everybody else is going to pay their taxes, but we're not getting the same returns. So what that means is you can set up a public swimming pool, ostensibly public, that I can't go to even though I pay for it. You can set up a public university system, ostensibly public, that I can't attend. All of that's part of the bill. So I don't actually think it ends with slavery, if I understood your question. You know, I think they're part of it.
Yeah, it's a part of it, but it's a large part of it. And what I'm trying to say is the suffering. Mr. Ross, that you go to great detail to talk about in the article, he comes from Mississippi. He's a descendant of an African slave. My great-grandfather...
But housing is the central part that I argue in the piece.
Well,
right?
Okay. Thank you.
Let me come over to this gentleman.
Well, I'm here to grant Jeffrey's wish for another Palestinian. I'm a Palestinian American. I just wanted to say I found your piece brilliant. I didn't need convincing before, but after your piece, I think it is one of the most well-packaged, sort of the most well-packaged, like pieces of ammo we have in our arsenal in advocating for reparations. So I thank you for that. That said, you know, I want to touch upon, and in a very different way than a question that was asked earlier, I've spent a lot of my activist career sort of making connections, actually, between, you know, my family are Palestinian citizens of Israel and African American communities. 2 years ago, I recorded Dr. Vincent Harding reading one of the most eloquent letters written to a Palestinian prisoner, expressing the similarities to experiences of his own and those of Dr. King. I think that the comparison to the Holocaust reparations is actually very apt. And in fact, I personally think that the reparations did not go far enough to individual Jews. I mean, you hear about a lot of individual Jews still struggling after those reparations. And that's one of the things I'm wondering about, is in terms of what ends up happening and who receives this overall. I know you touched on that a little bit. But I do also want to know, you know, when you use the examples of, you know, the modern state of Israel, I'm not going to touch on that, but you gave the examples of David Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin. And to me, those individuals stand for the sort of plunder, destruction, and racism that you actually yourself are writing about in this piece. Was there a moment of reflection about that? Did you think about it? I know it's not the primary focus of the piece. It's not to derail for it, but, you know, I'm curious if you did.
Yeah, no, I did. We sent it out to a lot of people who, you know, read it and gave critique, and that was one of the things that came up. For me, you know, rightly or not, this is pretty easy, okay? America tells a story about immigration. It's very proud that it took on, you know, say, Irish folks who were persecuted by Cromwell. America is very, very proud about that, right? It's very proud of, you know, bringing in Italians, bringing in, you know, any persecuted group, uniting them under this flag of America. What did the Irish do here in New York during the draft riots? You know, and I want to be like really, really clear about that. Does that mean that I think that, you know, it was wrong that the Irish could come here? You know, the problem is...
Talk for 1 minute about what the Irish did.
Yes, yeah. Well, what they did was they rioted and they burned down an orphanage, and it's one of the greatest mass disturbances in American history. And the fact that, you know, Irish folks were let in, it didn't necessarily make them any more sympathetic or any more politically conscious or any more, you know, apt to do any justice on behalf of African Americans. Does that mean, therefore, that Irish Americans didn't deserve justice? Does that mean that they weren't owed something? You know, reparations doesn't solve everything, it does solve one thing. But doing justice to one group of people does not guarantee that we're going to have justice, that that group will then be just towards everybody else. But that's a very, very different question about whether the justice should have been done in the first place. Am I being clear here? Do you understand?
Oh, yeah. I mean, and also many Jews around the world got reparations, not just in Israel. I mean, that's one of the things that's being left out of the conversation.
We're just going to go here. We're going to do this and one final question? Okay, over here. Yes.
I'm curious about who you imagined as your audience for the piece and balancing the fact that you want to speak to black people about their history and to them, but also to people who might be living in white privilege and might be not aware of these issues, and you have to sort of convince them. So how do you balance those two very disparate audiences?
I don't. You know, and it's a good question. It's one that comes up all the time, but I try to talk to white people straight. You know, and that is, I try to, you know, write the article as I would write the article, as I would want to read it. And I think, like, I hope, like, there's some level of respect. You know, listen, if I go to, a lecture to hear, you know, a feminist author talk about, you know, sexism and misogyny, I don't want my hand held. You know, just tell me what's going on. I'm an adult, I can handle it. You know, and I don't think there's any responsibility to sort of hold white people's hands and, you know, guide them through it. You know, you do write the history, you know, in an aggressive way, but I tried to speak as, you know, as I felt. And I think people want that. You know, I would want a reader who wanted that.
Thank you.
And then thank you. Last question.
Okay. Earlier you said that in some egregious cases the state might participate, but I was wondering if it's actually egregious given your research. And I'm thinking specifically about the notion of black citizenship being a problem ever since it was a reality. And then the second part of that question is, what happens when knowledge butts against belief? So in your case, your beliefs changed when you encountered knowledge. But as a teacher, I know that I'm always working against that, right? Yeah. So sometimes people have the knowledge and they have the information, but the belief is so strong that it overrides the information.
Yeah, I mean, that right there is a problem. I mean, there's no guarantee that information is going to cure everything, right? Especially when you have an advantage in not knowing. Like when you can, you know, get a check out of not knowing, where it advantages you, you know, financially to not know, to cover things. Listen, here's what I'll say, because, you know, I generally sort of share that skeptical perspective. I will end on a high note. I never thought I would say this. And maybe I shouldn't say it, but I'm going to say it. The number of white people who have come up to me, you know, just like, yeah, I didn't know. You know, I didn't get that. You know, I didn't get that, and I feel a little different. It has been heartwarming. Now, right, oh, that's so cute. Whether that equates any sort of support, whether that equates any justice, whether that gets anybody any closer on the issue, I don't know. I don't know. You know, I you know, can write the most compelling, the most powerful, the most, you know, just, the most reported, the most nuanced, the most textured story that I'm capable of doing. And then after that, you know, other people who play other roles in a democratic, you know, state have to play their position too. You know, so I don't know. I don't know. I agree with you. You know, you should be skeptical of the idea that just having knowledge will necessarily change things.
Ta-Nehisi, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you.